Hi everyone, and welcome to our panel tonight. We've got a really special briefing for you on renewable energy leadership and how it's supercharging jobs in New South Wales. I'm Amanda McKenzie, I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, and I'm joined today by New South Wales Energy and Environment Minister Matt Kean, Climate Councillor and former Chair of ARENA, Greg Bourne, and leading economist and co-author of the Climate Council's Clean Job Plan, Andrew Charlton. So before I get started, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the country in which I'm working and living on at the moment, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners here, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and also extend that respect to elders in your part of this country, the traditional owners on the land on which you're joining us, and welcome any First Nations people who are on the call today. So tonight we're going to have a pretty short, sharp event. We've got 45 minutes together and we've received hundreds of questions from the community. So they'll be woven into the chat as we go. But if you have additional questions, please feel free to add them in the Zoom webinar chat too. And we'll keep working through them and see how many we can get through. So I'll ask all the panelists to be relatively brief so we can get through a lot of content. So to just give you a little bit of context for the panel, as 2021 concludes, there's unprecedented momentum around the world for climate action. You'd remember that at the start of the year, we had the horrifying Black Summer fires driven by climate change. They shrouded the cities in smoke, they razed towns, killed billions of animals. I think it shook all of us and put climate change front and center of the conversation. COVID-19 obviously turned the conversation elsewhere, necessarily towards the emergency health response, but there's been a latent concern in the community through the year. And the response of many governments here and around the world has been to find some win-win solutions to economic recovery, but also solutions that grow jobs, build new industries, and tackle climate change simultaneously. The response to COVID is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to set us up for the future. And one of the leading governments in the world has been New South Wales. You may have seen in the news recently the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap that Minister Kean launched and then got through Parliament a few weeks ago, which promises to deliver $32 billion in private investment in clean energy, build 12 gigawatts of renewable energy and 2 gigawatts of storage, all the while creating 23,000 jobs and, of course, importantly, getting down emissions, which is all about tackling climate change. So we want to hear from Matt today to explore that package, as well as hearing from our other experts on giving us some more context to it and what it means for Australia. So if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat as we go through, please say who you are and where you're dialing in from. But I'll pass the first question to you, Matt. Firstly, congratulations on the suite of commitments in the roadmap. Can you give us an overview of what the roadmap does, what sort of jobs it will create, and how it cuts emissions?
Amanda, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Could I say a big thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight and for supporting the Climate Council and the incredible work that you, Amanda, and the team do there. Look, I'm so proud that we've been able to sort of break the impasse, not just here in New South Wales, but hopefully lead the way across the country when it comes to tackling climate change, but doing it in a way that's going to grow our economy, create jobs, and drive investment into this state. And that's exactly what this plan is. It's a roadmap to deliver some of the cheapest, most reliable electricity you'll find anywhere on the planet. And based on the modelling that we've done, we think that we can provide the third cheapest electricity prices anywhere in the world. And that's not only good for domestic users, so mums and dads, families in the suburbs, our businesses, large and small. It also will see a renaissance of those energy intensive industries right here in New South Wales that are seeking a competitive advantage, particularly as the world moves to decarbonise. If you can have cheap, reliable, clean energy, you win in that environment. So that's what our roadmap's about. And we've done it for very good reason, not just an environmental one, but an economic one. In the next 15 years, 4 of our existing coal-fired power stations will come to the end of their lives. It's got nothing to do with climate change. It's just, it's got everything to do with the fact these are old bits of machinery built in the 70s and early 80s. They've already flagged to the market that they'll be closing. We need to make sure that we've got the market signals in place and the regulatory settings to ensure that that equipment is replaced before it closes. And that's with very good reason. We saw when Hazelwood closed in Victoria that New South Wales consumers saw an increase in their bills of up to 60%. We can't afford to let that happen when we lose Vales Point, Araring and Bayswater. That's why we've put in place a plan to replace the existing infrastructure with new infrastructure before they close. And right now, the focus of that plan is ensuring that we get the cheapest form of reliable electricity. And today, that's a combination of wind, solar, pumped hydro and batteries. For the moment, there is a bit of gas in that mix as well, but our long-term future is a combination of those other technology. And that's not spin, that's what the CSIRO is telling us. That's what AEMO, the independent market operator, is telling us. So what we've done is design a policy with the experts, engineers and economists. And we think that should be making decisions based on good science, good evidence, and expert opinion. And that's exactly what we've done. It's got us through the COVID crisis, and it's exactly how we should get through the climate change crisis as well. So that's a bit of an overview, Amanda.
Thanks, Matt. Another question for you. Australia's now got 3 state Liberal governments, New South Wales, Tasmania and South Australia, who have some of the strongest renewable energy policies in the country. What message does that send to the federal government, but also to Liberal voters around the country?
Well, look, every jurisdiction has different challenges. The challenges in Tasmania are different to the ones in New South Wales. Tasmania's entire grid was pretty much built on hydroelectricity, and they're looking to grow what they're already doing. South Australia, a lot of the legwork was done by the previous Labor government, and the current Liberal administration is continuing that on. And in New South Wales, the challenges that we face are that our existing coal-fired power stations clapped out. Last summer, every day it went over 30 degrees. I'd have to front the TV cameras and tell people to turn off their air conditioners. This wasn't some third world country. This wasn't Somalia. This was Sydney. And it wasn't because you had renewables in the system. It's because the existing coal-fired power stations weren't working when we needed them to work. They weren't able to cope with peak demand. We need to modernise our system, but we need to do it in a way that's going to deliver cheaper, reliable electricity. And that's exactly what our roadmap's about. So again, the message it sends to the market, the message it sends to the Commonwealth is that each state and territory is designing policies to put the needs of their communities first. And that's what we've done. We know that we need to replace our existing infrastructure. We need to do it in a way that is not based on ideology, it's based on evidence. And that evidence today says the cheapest way to deliver reliable electricity is a combination of wind, solar, pumped hydro and batteries. And that's only going to get cheaper. So we're investing for the future. We know that if we install that infrastructure now, it's not going to be ready for a number of years in the future. A renewable energy zone in Texas took about 8 years to build. Pumped hydro is not a short run exercise. That also takes, a long time to build. So by getting the market signals in place right now, getting the regulatory settings in place, we're encouraging the private sector to build the infrastructure we know has a long lead time so that we're prepared for when those existing assets close. And the beauty of our scheme is that it is very liberal and very economically rational. We're getting the private sector to do what needs to be done. And they're voting with their feet, they're voting with their capital, and they're saying we want to play in New South Wales as a result of this policy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. Andrew, I'll bring you in here. You've got first-hand experience constructing budgets in the wake of economic crises as Kevin Rudd's economic advisor during the GFC. How would you rate New South Wales, the New South Wales government's recovery plan for rebooting the economy and setting Australia on the pathway to net zero emissions?
Well, it was a very impressive environmental budget. It contained a lot of extremely positive initiatives, very strong and far-sighted program on renewable energy, significant waste management programs, environmental water and coastal environmental protections, And you know, these sorts of things are all the more impressive because it's so hard to do environmental reform in Australia. And the history of Australian climate change policy, sadly, is 15 years of mostly failure, punctuated by small steps forward. So it was a very impressive budget and an important step forward, and great to see New South Wales showing leadership. I think, you know, for me, the really deep question that we can pull out of the New South Wales budget is, how do we reboot national reform on climate change to get a national answer and national consensus? And I think there are two ingredients, and the first one of those ingredients is political courage. And you know, Matt has shown that in this debate, in the face of extremely strong opposition and some very heavy vested interests. But I think the second ingredient that is important and probably doesn't get enough focus, or at least doesn't get the right focus in Australia, is working on the genuine economic and employment concerns of those Australians who are most affected by the climate and economic transition. You know, if New South Wales closes 4 power plants, people lose jobs. If we undertake a broad energy transition, some people lose jobs. And our traditional answer to that is to say, well, we're going to create a lot more jobs. And in many ways, that's a good answer. And it's true that there'll be a lot of jobs created by renewable energies. But it does sound a bit remote to some people. You know, I'm an economist. If you told me that I was going to lose my job in economics, but don't worry, there are plenty of jobs in physics, I'd be a bit unnerved by that. And I think a lot of Australians are unnerved when they hear about the loss of significant jobs that they're in, and that concern isn't fully offset by the gain in other jobs. And here's the conundrum. You know, there are about, in federal politics, there are about 25 marginal seats that change hands between Labor and Liberal. And the people in those seats are 3 times more likely to work in the mining, energy and manufacturing industries. So the people who determine the outcomes of Australian federal elections are the people who are most affected by the employment impacts of the climate transition. And so I think if we really want to unlock the deadlock in Australian climate policy, if we really want to cut through the gridlock, we need to get a better and stronger solution for those people. And you know, one of the things I've been really struck by over this last year is the influence of a big program like JobKeeper. You know, that program gave Australians massive confidence. It got us through a huge pandemic. It made businesses make decisions which on the face of it were entirely uneconomic, like keeping their doors open through a crisis, like keeping their workers on board through a crisis. And I wonder if we need something bigger, some big program that directly tackles those people in those marginal seats who are most exposed to this transition. Something that is inspired by the type of strong policy action we had through the pandemic. And if we focus on that, that might be one of the missing links to make sure that we deliver the clean energy transition that Australia needs.
Thanks, Andrew. Some really useful points there around what a transition looks like for workers in those areas, as well as the reference to political courage being critical. Greg, you're the author of the annual Climate Council report ranking states and territories on their renewable policies. How does this New South Wales plan influence New South Wales ranking compared to other states? And how are state governments with renewable energy policies better placed to survive economic or environmental shocks and build back better?
So it's interesting, we've been ranking the states for, I think it's 6 years now or something like that. And some states have moved forward faster. New South Wales, until recently, was in the middle of the pack. And you know, look, I have to congratulate Matt and you know, New South Wales for driving forward, because to me, one of the things that's happened in this last year is, and partially driven by COVID, partially driven by technology, is this recognition that the states are actually, and the territories, are actually the sort of the powerful entities. They're the ones that have the people, they're the ones that have the jobs. They're the ones that actually lose opportunities or gain opportunities by embracing new technologies and embracing transformation. So I see New South Wales now sort of leaping forward, really towards the front of the pack. But I also am really encouraged by basically all the states and territories, whether they are Liberal or Labor or mix, they're all now moving forward. And one of the things that strikes me is that if you look for leadership in this from the federal government, I don't think you'll find it. And the reason, part of the reason is political, capital P political, but part of it is how do you consensus build other than around a low common denominator? And we can't do that if we're going to transform our industrial processes with regard to electricity and energy. And therefore the leadership, the embracing the future by New South Wales, by Matt, by other jurisdictions, is something that I am really, really pleased to be seeing, because I think that's going to drive us forward in really quite a big way. So congratulations, Matt. Hard ask, but nicely delivered.
Thanks, Greg. Matt, the bill that you managed to get through Parliament to make the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap a reality received cross-partisan support. And as Andrew said, obviously this issue has been hugely vexed, and it's been, the climate wars have been a major challenge in Australia in getting policy up. In terms of building that consensus, how did you go about that? And do you think there's opportunity for consensus more broadly? And as Andrew mentioned, particularly in some of those regions, we've seen some questions coming through now about the Hunter in particular and the need for transition plans in areas like the Hunter. Could you speak to the consensus building aspect, as well as how we transition communities like the Hunter so that there are lots of opportunities as the transition occurs?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we learned the lessons of the last decade of failure when it came to climate change. And that is that in order to build lasting and durable reform, you need to build a broad coalition effectively. And in order to do that, we needed a new brand of politics, a new brand of politics that was looking for areas of common ground rather than conflict and division. And for too long, tribal conflict, partisan politics has held back our country when it comes to dealing with climate change. We saw with COVID-19 how effective it was when we found areas of common ground and we worked together. We listened to the science, we listened to the evidence, and we made decisions based on that. And Australia arguably handled the pandemic better than anyone else in the world. So I wanted to take the same approach when it came to tackling climate change. Now, in order to build that multi-party coalition, we had to find those areas of common ground and understand the issues that were driving the different parties. In my own party, there were Conservatives in the Liberal Party that had previously been staunchly opposed to action. That's why we focused, we had a laser-like focus on the economics. We needed to make sure that what we were doing was actually going to deliver some of the cheapest and most reliable electricity anywhere in the world. So we designed our policy settings around that. We knew that the voice of the bush, the National Party, they were concerned about regional communities, investment into the regions, jobs in the bush. So this package was one that was focused on driving that investment into the bush, creating those jobs and delivering those cheap electricity prices to those energy intensive industries, which are largely located in the regions. We knew the Labor Party were focused on their members in the union movement, those blue collar workers that have been so important to driving our economic growth for so many generations. We needed to make sure that we satisfied the Labor Party's concerns about those jobs being Australian jobs, the steel and the aluminium that would be used to build these renewable energy zones that would be manufactured here by Australian workers. And that's what we incorporated into the policy. We too worked with the Greens, who said that they wanted investments in things like hydrogen technology. That was incorporated into the bill. So we built a multi-party coalition based on areas of common ground. And we had good faith negotiations where we put the community first rather than vested interest first or political interest first. So that was the key thing. The second part of your question is about making sure that we look after those people that would be affected by this transition. Andrew hit the nail on the head. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind in this discussion. There is an amazing opportunity for Australia to be one of the most prosperous countries on the planet as a result of this shift towards a low carbon global economy. But we've got to grab that opportunity, and we've got to face the reality that there will be some winners and losers. And for those that are working in existing industries, those that are working in mining or coal-fired power generation, we need to be conscious that some of these jobs will be changing and shifting. We need to provide those communities, those workers, with the support they need. And I loved Andrew's idea about a job keeper package as we undergo this transition. And let's not forget, we need to be honest with the Australian community. A lot of these jobs, they're not going to be affected by domestic decisions. Their fortunes are going to be determined by these international megatrends. And we are being dishonest in saying that somehow, we can stop those trends happening. They're going to occur. And for a small open market economy like Australia, we need to embrace the change, but support those to make sure we leave no one behind.
Thanks, Matt. Just coming back to you, Greg, and pivoting to the gas story. Gas has really dominated a lot of the energy conversation this year, and the commentary has moved from gas being viewed as relatively benign at the start of the year to it be journalists and the public becoming much more aware of the climate impacts of gas, both in the mining and supply chain, as well as in burning of gas, as well as the economics have been questioned. The Climate Council has just released a report on gas. Could you tell us a little bit about what that means in the context of a clean recovery and policies for renewable energy?
Yeah, I could start bursting out laughing in terms of gas's role in the clean recovery. I see it as having actually no role. But let's unpack that a little bit. So, gas is just one of the fossil fuels. We're trying to tackle climate change, and exploring for developing, transporting gas and then using it in a big way is a bit like pouring gasoline on a fire and trying to hope it'll put it out. It's just not going to work like that. But where's that drive coming from? The drive is clearly coming from the gas producers, the gas transporters, the big gas users. There's a lot of money driving a whole agenda of, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a gas-led recovery? And yet any economic analysis looks at it and says, hang on, some of our gas in the ground, places like Narrabri, it's very expensive. It's not going to bring prices down. We're not going to have a sudden burgeoning of a manufacturing industry, whether it be in New South Wales or elsewhere. And those companies that are actually looking to the future are looking, how do they move away from gas? Do they move to hydrogen for heating? Do they move electricity for heating? What do they do? So the chances of a gas-led recovery are very slim to, I would actually say, nil. But again, come back to that metaphor, gasoline, pouring it onto a fire and hoping it will put it out. It doesn't work. What we are going to see on a global basis is gas phasing itself out of the system. It will help take some of the coal out of the system over time, but phasing itself out. The proponents of a gas-led recovery are basically hoping to get 20 years of milking the cash cow, as it were, and, well, this climate change stuff will go away and I'll have a lot of my money in my pockets. It's a bit of a farce, and don't want to laugh too much about it because it's very serious. A lot of lobbying is going on there, but it doesn't have a place in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Andrew, building on what Greg said and picking out some of the questions coming through from the audience, part of the reason there is this increasing scepticism around gas, beyond the fact that it's polluting, is that it will increasingly struggle to stack up against renewables economically. How do you think the economics alone will shift the energy balance in Australia, and what do you think is the right role for government to play?
Thanks, Amanda. Well, economics alone will cause renewables to stack up much better than gas. The only question is when. And what we need to do is make sure that the answer to that timing question doesn't cause us to make long-term investments in short-term technologies. The role of government is important here. Governments are understandably anxious to ensure that there is enough power in Australia to deliver reliable power. They are understandably anxious about near-term requirements across the grid, but the way to respond is to accelerate that transition, to give clear signals to the market and support the development of the technologies that will ultimately underpin cheap, reliable power long into the future.
Thanks, Andrew. So Matt, for you, we've got quite a few questions coming through about Narrabri and a range of other sort of gas interests. I wondered if you can speak to the catch cry of the federal government of a gas-led recovery. You've described the Narrabri project as a gamble. You've said gas has no future in New South Wales. Can you expand on your thinking around the role that gas will play over the next few years and why it won't have a long-term role?
I think we need to be realistic. I think gas still will continue to play a role, but it's not the role that some are trying to say that it is. 80% of the gas used in New South Wales is for the purposes of industrial activity, so heating and manufacturing. That's where the majority of our gas goes. As Greg said, using gas to generate electricity at the prices that are being proposed out of Narrabri, for example, is actually a really expensive way to generate electricity. So I think if you're using gas to generate electricity at about $8, which is around what it costs to pull out gas at the wellhead from Narrabri, then you're talking about electricity prices at about $120 per megawatt hour. Now, that's far in excess of what we're currently paying, which is about $70, $75 per megawatt hour with coal. That was pre-COVID, and well above what we think that we'll be paying as a result of our roadmap, which is between $45 and $50 per megawatt hour. So back to your point, Amanda, it's all about the economics, and we should be making decisions based on the economics, based on the evidence, based on the engineering. We need the system to work. We need it to be reliable. And right now, the cheapest way to deliver electricity is a combination of wind, solar, and pumped hydro. Does gas play a role in our electricity system at the moment? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, particularly at those times of peak demand. We need, some gas to make sure that we're firming up the renewables. But as battery technology continues to come down the cost curve, as solar and wind gets even cheaper, then the idea of using gas to generate electricity is just like saying we want people to pay more for a dirtier fuel. So I'm again focused on the economics and focused on the evidence, and to me, all the evidence and economics tell me that renewables are the cheapest way to deliver reliable electricity, particularly when backed up by pumped hydro and batteries.
Thanks, Matt. And I think one of our staff will put the gas report that we've just published in the chat there in case anyone's interested. But that report that's come out last week, we're very clear about there's a small role, as Matt and Greg have described, of existing infrastructure. But what we've said in the report is there's no need for new mines and new infrastructure to support gas. I'll move on now, given the time, to the international situation, which has changed dramatically in the last few months, particularly with the Biden election. But also a number of our trading partners have, of course, introduced net zero targets and said that they'll get out of coal. Greg, can you talk about these changes in the international situation? We've got the Climate Ambition Summit coming up, and it's been profiled in the media that Australia has not been invited to speak at that. What do you think are the implications of this from the changing international climate policy for Australia?
Well, firstly, let's just say that the whole climate change issue is the construct in which this transformation in the energy world is happening. So we are seeing, impacts in multiple countries around the world. People are getting a much greater precision on what's going to happen to their state, territory, city, and so on like that. And that driver is coming through with strong climate ambition now we'll see it from the United States, but coming from Europe, coming from many other countries as well, even coming from China. that I think is going to drive things in a very, very big way. We've got the technology, it's coming through, the finance is going straight towards it, the finance is fleeing from the fossil fuel world. We will start seeing border tariffs going on people who are using, dirty products, dirty energy to create manufacturing industries and so on. That we will see politically imposed tariffs on countries, possibly like Australia, who don't actually pull their weight. We're seeing politically imposed tariffs at the moment from China. Those are politically imposed, but they are affecting us, quite significantly, and there's nothing to do with climate change. But we are going to see such a change in this world, and I think 2021 and 2022, if we're not part of the action and really have pivoted our international policies, we I think have a real problem. We'll face a real problem. I think that, as I said earlier on, the states and the territories leading by example is key. In the international fora, it has to be the federal government that actually pivots. And we need to see that very, very, very fast. Otherwise, we are going to be hurt badly. And what I want to see is us embracing the future, embracing the opportunities for new export industries, for example, and new clean industries, rather than just hugging the past. But we have to pivot at the federal level.
Thanks, Greg. Matt, Vicky has a question for you that she's sent through today, which references the UN GAP report, which has just come out, which shows Australia at the back of the global pack. It's an assessment of where countries are stacking up on their targets and policies. And it put us at the back of the pack due to weak pollution reduction targets, and it concluded that we were not on track to meet those targets. The government data that's out today is saying that we will meet our Paris targets in 2030 without using the so-called Kyoto credits. But it's clear in that data that it's largely as a consequence of the work the states like yours have been doing. You've discussed New South Wales being an energy superpower and an economic superpower. What's your broader vision for Australia and what we could be in the world in responding to the climate crisis?
As I've said previously, and as you've quoted, I really think that we can be not only an energy superpower, but an economic one. We've got some of the best renewable resources anywhere on the planet. We've got, an abundance of wind, an abundance of solar. And the other thing we've got that certainly Europe doesn't have, and that's an abundance of cheap land, particularly, out in the bush. So it means we don't have to do things like offshore wind, which is really expensive comparatively. So we can get very cheap electricity. And when you get cheap electricity, that creates a boon in all those energy intensive industries, smeltering and aluminium and steel making. That's the opportunity for us. And the race is on. Last year I was over in Germany, and I spoke at a conference encouraging people to invest in New South Wales. And as soon as I finished speaking, the Minister from Morocco got up and said, well, that's great from New South Wales, but we're right on Europe's doorstep, and we've got a lot of sun and cheap land as well. And guess what? We believe in climate change. So, if we miss the boat, then that will come at the expense of our kids' jobs and our prosperity and future industry that will underwrite that prosperity here. So there's a lot at stake. And I'll just give you some stats. Alan Finkel says that the national hydrogen industry will be worth about $11 billion per annum in additional GDP by 2050. Green ammonia, for example, up $102 million for every percentage point of global market share that we capture here in New South Wales will add to our GDP. The same with green steel. It will see an additional $20 million in annual revenue for every percentage point increase in the industry right here in New South Wales. So this is real money. These are real jobs. These are real opportunities. And as I said, the race is on. If we don't move first, then we're going to be left behind and become a rust bucket state.
Thanks, Matt. I have to say I furiously agree with you on that. Andrew, when you published the Clean Jobs report with us, you looked at a range of different policies beyond electricity. there's opportunities, obviously, as state governments go into their next budget phase to look at policies beyond energy and electricity. I wondered if you can comment on the opportunities for states like New South Wales in doing the next phase of the recovery for those other policies that perhaps haven't been as addressed as substantively yet.
Sure. In the modelling that we did with the Climate Council to identify job creation opportunities across Australia, there were 12 main opportunities, which collectively would have created 76,000 jobs across Australia. And the great news is a number of them were in one form or another in the New South Wales budget. But there are certainly other areas like a lot more work on electric vehicles, particularly electric vehicle charging networks, accelerated energy efficiency measures, particularly in relation to building retrofits, progress on ecosystem restorations, and a lot more that can be done on the circular economy, as Matt noted in his introduction. I think New South Wales has actually made progress on all of these, to be fair, but these are all areas where there's a lot more to do. In fact, probably areas where there's always going to be a lot more to do, and they're fertile ground for the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Greg, there has been obviously a lot of conversation about the role of the federal government versus the role of the states in tackling climate change. And after years of federal inaction, the states have been gradually increasing their action. And you've been tracking that in one of our reports over the last 5 years that does an annual assessment of the states. Is it sufficient for the states to go it alone effectively and potentially even in a relatively coordinated way if the federal government sort of doesn't come to the party? How much can the states do on their own, and where do we need the federal government?
So certainly the states can do an enormous amount on their own. And if I look at the Eastern Seaboard, whatever is done there, whoever is putting up a project automatically is thinking about what is the ripple effect into the state next to me and the state in the other direction as well. So automatically, from a financial and a project point of view, you will be taking into account those states. That's not to say, and I think Matt quite naturally would like New South Wales to be slightly ahead of Queensland and slightly ahead of Victoria and slightly ahead of South Australia. That's great. That's a really, really good dynamic. But you still don't make a stupid investment, you are thinking. So I actually do believe the states' coordination can work incredibly well, particularly with AEMO and AEMC. And the federal government, to a large extent, I think should keep out of this. That's my own personal opinion. What would be very useful would be for them to pivot their policies to say, this is what we want to happen. We want Australia to be an energy superpower. We applaud the states, whatever colour their politics is, for working so well together to drive this forward. That would be a really good outcome. The danger so often with consensus is you end up with the lowest common denominator. You go at the pace of the slowest and to the standard of the lowest. This is not a time for going at the pace of the slowest and the standard of the lowest. This is embracing the future. And I really do believe the states and territories can do pretty much everything and coordinate it very, very well.
Thank you, Greg. Matt, we've got quite a few questions that have come through on EV policy, particularly in reference to the debate about state road user taxes on EV. New South Wales does have some support for growing EVs, particularly charging infrastructure. What's the plan to get more consumers into EVs?
So many of your viewers will know that we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Commonwealth Government that will see New South Wales have about $1.97 billion over the next decade to spend on other areas to reduce emissions. So new hydrogen projects, working with major industries to help them reduce their emissions, and working with regions to do things like carbon farming. But one of the key areas that we've set aside, hundreds of millions, make that very clear, hundreds of millions, will be for the strategic rollout of EV charging stations and the ability to catalyse the uptake of EVs. So we're focusing primarily on fleet buys because that will then catalyse the secondary market, which will mean that people can enter at a lower price as well. And as a result of that, we envisage that we'll be getting more EV makers selling into the New South Wales and indeed Australian market. I think we've got to get something like 2,000 car sales a year to get them to sell new models and things into the market. So we're going to put serious money behind building the infrastructure, serious money behind encouraging the uptake of EVs and making it accessible for everyday mums and dads. And it's only going to head in one direction. I mean, I was over in Germany last year, as I mentioned, and the German government is going to spend $50 billion in helping their car manufacturers all transition to EVs. You've got the UK government, which has basically banned combustion engines in the UK by 2030. We don't have a car industry here in Australia, which means that we have to take the products that are being made overseas. And let me tell you, the big car manufacturers are only going to be making one type of product, and they are clean vehicles.
Thanks, Matt. We're running low on time now, so I'm going to ask for a final brief reflection from each of you, which is really about what next. So I'd like you to imagine we're looking back from a vantage point of 2030 on the work that we did early in this decade, and imagine that we have set ourselves up, as you've described, Matt, to not only tackle the climate crisis, but to be an energy superpower and an economic superpower as a consequence. What do you think have been the most important things we've done over the decade? I'll start with you, Andrew.
Tough question. Look, I think there'll be a technology component. I think that there'll be a political component, and I think there'll be an investment component. And that's making big investments to back the clean energy sources of the future. It is about supporting those technologies and making sure they continue to deliver reliability and efficiency. And it's about generating a political consensus around the need for action, which ultimately will underpin good policy and community support. So those are the three broad categories, I think, of where we need to make progress.
Thanks, Andrew. Great off-the-cuff response. Greg, I'll pass on to you. What's your vision?
So looking back, I think we will have, sadly, we will have looked at some more environmental disasters. I think we will see more bushfires. I think we will see more floods. I think we will see more cyclones. We will see the impacts rising because of our previous inactions vis-a-vis climate change. Those should catalyze us for positive things, not for negative things. So we'll see that. I think we will see that we have worked out how to manage the social transformation in areas where people are losing jobs. And it's transformation, it's not transition, it's transformation. We have to manage that social transformation really, really, really well. And whether it's JobKeeper or something like that, the words can be invented by people that know about these things, we will have done that. Because only by building that consensus will we move forward. Technology, I have no worries about. The technology is leaping forward, really, really leaping forward. And I have no worries about the finance. The finance is leaping where the technology is leaping, and it's fleeing the fossil fuel area. So I think of the social and the environmental things that really matter. We'll look back on those. Perhaps the social transformation is probably going to be the most important one, handling that well.
And Matt, you get the last word.
I'm really optimistic about the future. I think it's really exciting what's happening internationally. I mean, with Joe Biden winning the White House, now 70%, or I think over 50% of the world's GDP is committed to net zero emissions, and 70% of Australia's two-way trade is committed to hitting net zero emissions by mid this century. We're really well placed to support not only those economies make that leap, but also our own economy, and do it in a way that will create jobs and drive investment and underwrite our prosperity for future generations. And all we've got to do is get the political will to go and grab the opportunity and set ourselves up for success. And I think that's happening. I think we're seeing it at a state level. I'm really positive about what's happening in Canberra. I think, the position of Scott Morrison is very different to what it was by some of his predecessors. I think, we can't keep yelling at, we can't have a partisan debate here. We need to bring everyone together, and we need to bring Conservatives along this journey as we do progressives. And only once we break that political impasse will we be able to move forward and bring about the change that needs to happen. But as Greg said, the most important and the biggest risk here is those communities that could be displaced, those jobs that could be removed. We can't afford to leave anyone behind. And until we have a solution to ensuring that that rising tide lifts all boats, then it's going to be a struggle. But I think there's some great ideas out there, and I really love the one that Andrew suggested tonight.
Thanks, Matt. Some really optimistic thoughts to leave the panel on, and thank you for your leadership. And we're looking forward to seeing more of it in 2021. Thank you to the hundreds of people who's joined us this evening and for sending through thought-provoking questions and having lots of comments through the chat. And thank you to the Climate Council team who's behind the scenes put this on. If you'd like more information on the Climate Council's Clean Jobs Plan, the link is coming through in the chat. And if there's bits you missed tonight or you want to revisit it, we'll be sending out the webinar recording tomorrow to everyone who's registered, and it will be going up on social media tomorrow as well. So stay tuned for more webinars like this. And thank you so much, Andrew, Greg and Matt, for your insights and also your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.